The irony of the current anti-foreigner protests in the UK is deeply rooted in the country's colonial history. For centuries, the British Empire was notorious for colonizing vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, forcibly displacing native populations and exploiting their resources. During the height of its empire, Britain not only took over foreign lands, but also imposed its culture, language, and systems upon indigenous people. Given this legacy, many critics of the current protests argue that Britain's own history is built on acts of migration and foreign dominance, making the present xenophobic stance hypocritical. Furthermore, the UK's contemporary demographic is a direct consequence of its imperial past. Many immigrants and descendants of migrants in Britain today come from former colonies, such as India, Pakistan, and the Caribbean, places whose people were encouraged to move to the UK during the post-war labour shortage. These communities contributed significantly to the rebuilding of Britain, yet they now face hostility from far-right groups. This historical context challenges the narrative of British identity as insular and isolated, reminding the nation of its entangled global history and complicating the idea of who the foreigners really are.
Firstly, thank you for watching, and don't forget to smash that like, subscribe, and notification bell for more global finance uncovered, as we continue to work hard and around the clock to always deliver and improve on our content for you. We would greatly appreciate your additional support by you clicking the like button, notification bell, and subscribe button and joining our channel's growth.
The hypocrisy of anti-foreigner protests in the UK becomes even clearer when considering Britain's historical reliance on immigrants for economic and cultural development. After World War II, the country was in desperate need of workers to rebuild its economy. The British government actively invited citizens from its colonies, particularly from the Caribbean and South Asia, to immigrate and fill crucial labour shortages. These immigrant communities contributed immensely to the UK's post-war recovery. Yet they and their descendants now face hostility from far-right protesters who demand the removal of foreigners. This backlash against immigrants dismisses their historical and ongoing contributions to British society. Moreover, Britain's colonial history also played a major role in shaping global migration patterns. The empire's expansion not only displaced people in colonized lands, but also created the very conditions that forced many to migrate. For example, British policies and economic exploitation in countries like India and Jamaica contributed to poverty, which pushed people to seek better opportunities abroad, including in the UK itself. As a result, many of the people labelled as foreigners by protesters today are, in fact, connected to the UK through the very imperial relationships that Britain once established.
Critics of the protests argue that Britain's identity has always been shaped by its global entanglements and history of migration, making it difficult to define a pure or native British identity. The presence of diverse communities within the UK is a direct legacy of the country's imperial past, and current anti-immigrant sentiment ignores this reality. The protests thus reveal not just xenophobia, but also a deep misunderstanding of Britain's complex historical and cultural tapestry, which has been enriched by the contributions of people from around the world. In recent months, the United Kingdom has been rocked by worsening protests, largely driven by far-right groups and misinformation. These protests initially escalated following a mass stabbing incident in Southport in July 2024, where 3 children tragically lost their lives. The far right, fueled by false claims about the attackers' identities, seized on the moment to mobilize, sparking riots and protests across the country. Many of these protests targeted immigrants and asylum seekers, with hotels housing asylum seekers in places like Rotherham and Southend becoming focal points for violent demonstrations. The misinformation, which falsely claimed the attacker was a Muslim asylum seeker, spread rapidly on social media. This disinformation exacerbated tensions, leading to violent confrontations between protesters and police. Various cities, including Birmingham, Manchester, and London, saw chaotic scenes as rioters clashed with law enforcement, resulting in arrests and injuries on both sides. The police, aided by body-worn cameras and drones, have compiled evidence to arrest many involved in these riots. However, the scale of the unrest continues to strain the UK's resources. In response, the government has taken swift legal action, prioritizing prosecutions to curb the violence. The Crown Prosecution Service (CPS) has already charged numerous individuals with offenses ranging from violent disorder to more serious crimes like rioting, which carries a potential 10-year prison sentence. Some rioters could also face terrorism charges, particularly for severe acts of far-right violence. These prosecutions are seen as crucial for restoring order, though concerns about prison capacity have been raised as the number of arrests continues to rise. The protests have also intensified debates about policing strategies. Some have accused the police of two-tier policing, suggesting they have been more lenient with certain groups. Critics argue that the authorities have struggled to balance maintaining public order while protecting the right to peaceful protest. The handling of these protests has drawn comparisons to past events, such as Black Lives Matter demonstrations, further deepening divisions across society.
Pro-immigration and anti-racism groups have staged counter-protests, particularly in cities like Glasgow and London. These demonstrations have often been in direct opposition to far-right groups, seeking to challenge their narrative and offer solidarity to migrant communities. While these counter-protests have largely remained peaceful, the tension between opposing sides has created an ongoing atmosphere of volatility across the country. Local communities have been deeply affected by the unrest. In areas where violence has erupted, residents have expressed concerns about their safety, with some fearing that the unrest could continue for the foreseeable future. Business owners, especially in protest-hit areas, have faced significant disruption, with many reporting damage to their properties due to vandalism and looting. The government has faced criticism for its handling of the situation, with some accusing Prime Minister Keir Starmer's administration of not doing enough to address the root causes of the protests. Immigration and asylum policies remain at the heart of the debate, with far-right groups using these policies as a rallying point for their protests. However, the government has defended its actions, citing the complexity of balancing security with civil liberties. The involvement of far-right figures like Tommy Robinson has further inflamed the situation. Robinson, a notorious figure in British far-right politics, has been accused of inciting violence and using his platform to spread false information. His promotion of rallies, particularly in Glasgow, has drawn significant attention, with many warning of the dangers posed by his influence on the protests. Despite efforts to quell the violence, protests show no signs of abating. Many fear that the riots, if left unchecked, could further destabilize already fragile community relations in the UK. The far-right's use of social media to spread misinformation remains a significant challenge for authorities, as efforts to counter disinformation lag behind the speed at which it is disseminated. Looking ahead, it is clear that the UK faces an uphill battle in restoring peace and addressing the underlying issues that have fueled these protests. The strain on public services, particularly the police and courts, is likely to continue as rests increase. Meanwhile, the broader social debate around immigration, identity, and nationalism continues to polarize the nation, with little sign of resolution in the near future. As the UK navigates this period of turmoil, many hope for a de-escalation of violence and a return to more constructive dialogue. However, with emotions running high on both sides and political tensions remaining unresolved, the path forward remains uncertain. The protests have exposed deep divisions in British society, highlighting the urgent need for a more comprehensive approach to healing these rifts. Recent protests in the UK have intensified, particularly driven by far-right groups demanding the removal of all foreigners from the country. These protests, which have turned violent in several cities, are linked to deep-seated xenophobic sentiment, further inflamed by misinformation surrounding a tragic knife attack in Southport in July 2024. 3 children were killed during the attack, and initial false reports claimed that the attacker was an asylum seeker. This narrative fueled anger and protests. Despite the suspect being a British-born individual, the protests have rapidly spread across various UK towns, with demonstrators targeting immigrants and refugees, calling for their removal. Far-right activists, emboldened by false claims on social media, have pushed a narrative that links immigration to crime, tapping into broader fears about national identity and safety. Many of the protests have escalated into riots, with violent clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement. The government has responded by deploying thousands of police officers to control the unrest, but tensions remain high. Many participants in these protests argue that immigration policies have been too lenient, leading to an influx of asylum seekers and migrants. This has created a platform for anti-immigration groups to amplify their demands for stricter controls and even the expulsion of foreigners from the UK. The far-right's rise has not gone uncontested, however. Anti-racist counter-protests have emerged across the country, with thousands of demonstrators marching in opposition to the xenophobic rhetoric. These counter-movements are pushing back against the narrative that immigrants are responsible for the country's problems, and they are advocating for inclusion and tolerance. Many experts have pointed out that these protests are symptomatic of deeper societal issues. Economic insecurity, post-Brexit uncertainties, and heightened fears about terrorism have all contributed to the current political climate. The protests are seen by some as a manifestation of frustrations over broader social and economic challenges, with immigration becoming a scapegoat. Authorities are investigating the role of online disinformation in stoking these tensions. Misinformation about the Southport incident, particularly regarding the suspect's background, was spread widely on social media by far-right influencers, and it is believed that some of this disinformation may have been part of a coordinated effort. In the wake of the protests, several political leaders have called for a more measured approach to immigration policy, while condemning the violence. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, for instance, has faced criticism for not doing enough to quell the unrest or address the underlying issues fueling the protests. Some members of his party have urged for a tougher stance on both immigration and far-right extremism. The protests have also led to international repercussions. Several countries have issued travel warnings to their citizens about visiting the UK due to the ongoing unrest, particularly in areas where violence has broken out. This has further strained the UK's global image at a time when it is trying to redefine its post-Brexit role on the international stage. Amidst the unrest, many communities have been left shaken, particularly in areas where immigrants have been directly targeted. There are reports of attacks on businesses owned by immigrant and vandalism at places associated with minority communities, leading to a heightened sense of fear among affected groups. The situation remains fluid, with both sides, the anti-immigration protesters and their opponents, continuing to organize demonstrations. As the UK government struggles to restore order, the protests raise critical questions about the future of immigration policy and the social fabric of the country.
Thank you for watching, and don't forget to smash that subscribe, like, and notification bell for more global finance uncovered.